And hello to everybody who has joined us here today. I hope everyone's day is off to a good start. We're excited to present to you today some of the upcoming changes to your Citrix environment and what you need to know around those changes. I appreciate everybody attending. Following the call today or the webinar, we'll be following up with some details on how you can redeem a Grubhub gift card. And we'll also be leaving the chat open. There's a few slides that I'm sure as we're reviewing some questions will come up. Feel free to place any of those questions in the chat, and then we can cover them in the question and answer segment. But I appreciate everybody for attending. We'll go ahead and get started on presenting these changes and what you need to know. Before we kind of dive in, I'll just quickly introduce myself as I'll be leading and hosting the webinar today. I'm Brittany Bond, one of the business development managers with Wincourse Technologies. And joining me on the webinar are two fantastic engineers. I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Yep, Ryan, you have the honors. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Ryan Freese. I'm a technology consultant. I actually work for an organization called Ingram Micro. We're a large technology distributor. We work very closely with partners such as Wincourse. Fun fact, Dave and I, who's also on the call, Dave Warner from Wincourse, used to work with each other over at Citrix. So long-time Citrix engineer of about 6 years now. Geez, time flies. So thank you all for joining, and hope this webinar is helpful for you.
Awesome. And I'm Mark Powell, one of the engineers on staff here at Wincourse. I've been in technology for about 15 years with end user compute cloud focus for the last 12 or so. So I work here with Brittany and the rest of the gang, and I recognize a few names here. Some of you I haven't talked to in a while, so glad you could make it. Excited to give you guys some information today.
Awesome, guys. Thanks for joining me on the panel today. And as Ryan kind of mentioned, we also have included on the call David Warner, who's one of the other business development managers here at Wincourse, and Daniel Chiari, who's a representative from Citrix, to also help answer questions and add some commentary.
Hi, team. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties at the beginning.
You're all good, Dan. We get it. Thanks for joining. So you're probably wondering what we're going to review on the webinar today. So here's a quick idea of the agenda. So we've already reviewed introductions. Next, we're going to start talking through some of the current state of Citrix and what you can expect with its future state, some of the benefits of moving to the Citrix Cloud model. The Citrix deployment options will follow. We'll review some of the value adds to those deployments and some of the concerns to consider with some of the deployment options. And then what to consider if you want to keep your Citrix on premise. That'll be a good slide where we'll review some of the changes and things that you would need to know if you want to remain on premise. And then some business questions to consider that have come up in some of our previous experience, some helpful resources, and we'll finish with some Q&A. So to kind of start out, we wanted to first get a pulse of what everybody who's attended Citrix environment kind of looks like. So could you give us an idea of what your current Citrix footprint looks like? Are most of your licenses still on premise? Do you have an environment that is all cloud, or are you a little bit of a mixed environment and fall more in that hybrid? So we'll give everybody a second here to kind of ring in their answers.
I see some quick voting, so thank you all. Looks like we got about 70% participants so far. I see quite a mixed bag, a lot of on-premise, a lot of hybrid, so mix of on-premise and cloud. And looks like a couple of you are fully cloud, which is very interesting to see. We don't see a lot of fully cloud. So we'll let it run for another 5 seconds or so, and we'll end the poll.
Awesome.
Great, let's end the poll. Thank you all for voting. Again, it looks like we have mostly on-premise, and then secondly, hybrid, and then a couple of all cloud.
Awesome. Well, let's take a look at some of the changes to Citrix, what the current state looks like, and then what the future state would be.
So if you guys have deployed traditional Citrix deployment, whether it's in public cloud or on-premise, you're probably pretty familiar with the diagram on the left. These are all the components that you would need to stand up a full Citrix solution with Citrix virtual apps and desktops, right? So you have your controllers that broker connections to your workloads for your users. You have your management tools set up like Citrix Studio, where you have your inventory, your catalog of items, director for troubleshooting environment and gathering performance statistics and helping your users out when they need help. And then all that talks to a SQL server, right, where you store all your data from your site. And then you have your storefront, which is your web server component that actually users will log into internally, and they would then see their resources that are available to them. And then if you're distributing these resources outside of your network through the internet, you most likely have a NetScaler gateway sitting out there. This is basically just your reverse proxy out, right, through your firewall, allows your users to come in, log in, access their desktops, their apps from anywhere in the world. And then you have the actual workloads, right? You may be running virtual apps or full published desktops or full VDI. Those are all going to be your VDAs. And then everything is contained in Active Directory, usually for your authentication. You may have some two-factor in there. You may have it hooked into a third-party identity provider, right? So if you fast forward to what Citrix Cloud is doing now, well, let me just take a step back. All these components that you have on-prem, whether you're running a long-term release or you're running the quarterly releases from Citrix, you have to update those components, right, to keep them compliant. If you're running current release, I believe the support lifecycle is 1.5 years, so you can only go back 6 versions or so. So you have to keep that consistent. If you're running long-term release, you still have to do updates for security patches and things like that on the Citrix side, but you have a longer support life cycle, right? It's usually about 5 years. If you move into Citrix Cloud, all of those management, those supporting infrastructure components go away. They don't necessarily go away, but they're invisible to the consumer. So they all sit on the back end in Citrix's management. They manage all of it for you. They deliver out your traditional director and your Citrix Studio through a browser. It's all done through the web, right? And all the updates are done in the background seamlessly by them. You still have some components that you're responsible for. Traditionally, you would have what's called a cloud connector. That would go in a resource location of your choice. You may have multiple of these, and these are going to broker the connections from the Citrix Cloud control plane back down to your workloads where your users are actually consuming their apps and desktops, right? So you would have these cloud connectors at each resource location, and then you'd have your traditional server and desktop VDAs that would then be brokered through those cloud connectors. So in the Citrix Cloud service, the Citrix Gateway and the storefront service are included, and there's certain things you can do with them and certain things you can't. So it's improved a lot over the last few years. So you have a couple options. You can integrate it with Okta out of the box, or Azure AD, or Citrix's own SMS two-factor authentication. But if you want to do something a little more complicated or custom, I would say you want to use Duo or Semantic VIP or RSA, or you want to have some more customization wrapped around your authentication or your landing page, then you can optionally pull out the Citrix Gateway and or the Citrix Storefront and run that on-prem or in your resource location that's hooked into your domain. And then, Brittany, do you mind going to the next slide, please?
Okay.
So some of the benefits going to Citrix Cloud. It's faster to deploy workloads, I would say. If you think about it, you don't necessarily need infrastructure to build things. You can very easily throw this up on public cloud or have a private cloud provider stand this up for you, and it becomes invisible to you. It's just a service that you consume. So it becomes a lot easier to deploy. It's less time for you and your employees because you're doing less updates and less management that's being done inside the service that's available to you. You can adopt at your own pace, so you don't have to make this massive effort to build it all up at once. You can kind of cherry pick when and where you want to put things. And I would say it's a little bit more secure because a lot of times customers tend to not keep up on the latest cumulative patches and security updates, just because they're doing so many other things. So now that's done for you. But a huge benefit as well is if you guys have like geo disbursement in your organization, meaning you may have West Coast users, East Coast users, European users, users in Asia. Kind of the nice thing about this is you have one control plane to manage all your different resource locations, right? So traditionally, if you wanted to build for best performance, you'd build a Citrix farm in each one of those sites and have the users come in through that site to have the best performance. Well, you can hook in cloud connectors and say Azure West, Azure EU, right? And distribute that all through one console, one farm, without having to have multiples and doing redundant work and spending lots of time and extra money.
Yeah, I would say a big thing to add on to that as well is from a DR perspective. If you're planning on setting up any sort of disaster recovery site with the cloud version, because you have a single management plane and you can hook into multiple resource locations, makes it a lot easier to set up and manage that DR site, as an example. One other comment I want to make as well is if you are planning to leverage any sort of cloud workloads in the future, whether that be Windows Virtual Desktop, which has been becoming popular month over month, as it's still fairly new technology. Citrix Cloud is needed for managing cloud workloads. In other words, if you're running, some of you are still running on-premise Citrix, if you're planning on managing, say, WVD workloads or even a server OS in Azure or AWS, the on-premise version doesn't have that capability today. Only the cloud version has that. So that's another notation I think is important to know, because these studies have shown a lot of organizations out there are looking to move to some sort of multi-cloud, hybrid cloud model. And really the on-premise version it's not meant for that. It's meant for managing that on-premise deployment, and that's it.
Right, it's a good point, Ryan. And I'll add just something else to that too. There are some pieces. So most of the Citrix products now, whether it's endpoint management or virtual apps and desktops, can be run in Citrix Cloud as a hosted service. But there's some pieces that are only available as a service in Citrix Cloud. So there's performance and analytics, which will give you insights into your performance statistics in the environment where you're having problems. It's almost like a monitoring platform kind of built in. It's an add-on type of service. And then there's also security analytics, which will do things like, if you're familiar with heuristics, it'll look for like abnormal patterns from users, you know, or it'll look if they're going to specific sites that are malicious or they're doing things that are abnormal. And so you can kind of see that and get ahead of that before it becomes potentially problematic. So that's something that you can't integrate with an on cloud deployment, or excuse me, on-prem deployment.
Great stuff, guys. So those are obviously some of the benefits of moving to the Citrix Cloud model. We wanted to get a second pulse here of what some of the infrastructure behind that Citrix licensing looks like for you. So how is your current infrastructure deployed today? Are you leveraging a public cloud, a private cloud, 100% on-premise, or are you in a more of a hybrid deployment model? Looks like we got some results starting to come in.
See a good amount of on-prem.
Yep. Yeah, some on-prem, a couple of hybrid, a couple of public. It's funny because I'm big on looking at the big research organizations like Gartner and Forrester and things of that nature. They've done a lot of studies, and for most organizations that they've interviewed and talked with, C-level executives, they're seeing most of those organizations do have some sort of hybrid cloud strategy. They see that as the future. One thing I always like to talk about is, as a part of that hybrid cloud initiative, distributed cloud is this new data center trend. If you're unfamiliar with what a distributed cloud is, think of it as like a hybrid cloud where you have a mix of on-premise plus multiple cloud providers that you're leveraging for your infrastructure. But it takes into the edge into account, takes into edge computing where the user resides, where the resources reside. So it's essentially taking it a step further to try and improve performance for the user. But thank you all for voting. I'll go ahead and end this poll.
Yeah, so it looks like most of everybody has rang in around with the on-premise deployment. So as we kind of move into the second half of the presentation, we'll be focusing on what are the deployment options when you move into the Citrix Cloud model, and some of the value adds to those deployment options.
All right, so if you guys are on-prem, which the majority of you guys answered that you are on-prem, so you're probably aware of a lot of the benefits of being in an on-premise environment. So you know you have complete control over the environment. You can spec out the hardware. You can buy whatever hardware you want. You can customize it however you want. You can depreciate those assets over time. So depending on how your business wants to function, that may be a good thing, may be a bad thing, maybe something you're looking to change. But you support that whole stack, right? You're familiar with the environment. You own all the data, right? And that's probably what this is what people have been doing forever as far as Citrix. So we're just now starting to see a shift. So if you look at public cloud, you don't need any infrastructure to go into public cloud, right? It's all a service that you consume. It's fast to implement. There's no maintenance you have to do on that equipment. That's all handled by Google or Microsoft or Amazon for you. It's an operating expense, which again may be good or bad for you and your business. So some people like that utility-like billing, that predictability, and not having to spend that upfront capital. Public cloud will definitely let you do that. You can deploy based on regions where your users are very easily. Azure alone, I think, has 25 or 30 resource locations around the world and growing. So if there's a country or a locale where your users are, it's probably a place to put it in public cloud. If you look at private cloud, these are usually a little bit more customized. If you think about, you have a spec or you have a use case for a type of users in your environment, you can kind of take that to a private cloud provider and they can design that, build it out for you, and even support it if you wanted them to. There's very little to zero infrastructure required, just like public cloud, to get started. There's usually pieces built in to a private cloud solution that you wouldn't necessarily see in public cloud, such as redundancy in disaster recovery, backups, replication, security, antivirus, data loss prevention, all that kind of stuff. And there's typically, depending on the customer base that private cloud provider has, they may have to be under audit compliance through HIPAA or SOX, and they're going to go out and maintain that certification and go through those audits so that you don't have to do that. And you're typically going to get a higher level of support, I would say. You're probably going to get someone that knows your environment, that's intimately involved with it, that's regularly in the environment. So there's that as well. And then hybrid cloud gives you a lot of flexibility, right? You can have pieces of your infrastructure in your environment, your application servers, your SQL servers. Maybe you have Exchange you want to keep on-prem, but you want somebody to manage Citrix. So you have your on-prem data center, and then you have an extension to another provider or another location or public cloud, and that's your hybrid, and that's what works for you guys. Again, you can regionalize based on performance and system optimization for your locale and in your region, and you can minimize how much hardware you have to spend. Maybe you have an investment already, and you have an upcoming expansion or an acquisition, and you don't want to go out and procure a bunch of new hardware. You can get involved with a public or a private cloud provider and make that an extension of your network pretty seamlessly. So we talked about some of the good stuff, right? Let's talk about some of the stuff you might want to consider when you're evaluating these different options. So obviously equipment is expensive. If you're on-prem, you have to refresh it. Typically it's on a 3-year cycle unless you do extended support, right? And every time you do that, you have to tear it all down afterwards, and you have to build everything up new from the ground up. So you typically have to have the skill sets and expertise in-house to do that work, or you have to find somebody that can help you do that work. You need physical space to put the equipment. You have to have adequate power and cooling. Ideally, you want to make it redundant. You want to build out disaster recovery off-site. You need to make sure everything's backed up and replicated somewhere. And it just generally requires more staff to support that type of solution. Public cloud, some of the things you guys should be aware of is it can be more expensive. Over time, it probably is more expensive because you're not depreciating it. It's a reoccurring cost to the business. But if you go out and try and spec out, like do a pricing calculator through Azure, AWS, you can, to the best of your ability, select the number of instances you need, because everything in public cloud is cookie cutter with the amount of resources to each instance. So you may have one with 2 CPU and 4 gig of RAM and a certain amount of disk and a certain amount of IOPS on the storage. But that's it, right? There's no modifying that. So you can do that to the best of your ability to calculate how much you're going to need, but there's things that are not necessarily visible to the consumer. So you have at-rest storage that you'll be charged for. Anytime there's machines on, you're being charged for the compute and the storage. Whereas if you turn them off, then you're only charged for the cold storage at rest. There's metering on bandwidth, public IP costs. If you add in security or backup, those are all add-ons. So there's the lack of a customization there. And then you really need someone that has expertise on that particular platform you're looking at. So you need somebody that understands Azure, or you need somebody that understands AWS in order to properly build it, configure it, support it, and so on and so forth. Usually with public cloud, you're only going to get basic support included, which is essentially you send a ticket in or an email and someone sends you a written response in like 24 to 48 hours. You can go up in tiers where you're able to get somebody on the phone. I think there's like enterprise support, but it's where you have that ability, but it's expensive. It's very expensive. So those are some things you got to think about when you're looking at them. If you look at private cloud, you'll have like big players like Comcast, Cox, Rackspace. I think companies like Equinix even do some of this. But then you'll have smaller providers like Wincourse, and a lot of times people, when they look at private cloud providers, they don't want to be in vendor lock-in per se. They don't want to be like all in on one vendor. So there's questioning behind, like, is it a household brand name? Is the security adequate? What kind of this, that, and the other thing are you guys using? And the pricing is different for all the providers out there. So some guys are going to charge you, I say guys, but companies. Some companies are going to charge you on a stack of infrastructure. They may give you a certain number of servers and storage and say, here's your cost every month. And some are going to charge you for like a turnkey, or they're going to charge you just based on how much you consume, meaning resources. And some will bolt on support, some won't. How much they support is up for debate sometimes too. And then you want to know, what kind of company you're dealing with, right? What's their clientele, like who are some of their customers, how many years have you been in business, all that kind of stuff. And then moving on to some of the concerns in hybrid cloud. Anytime you have stuff in multiple places connected with different topologies and architecture, it's adding complexity, right? So that can be harder to manage. You may require additional skill sets to manage those environments. Is it secure between the 2 or 3 or 4 environments? Who manages what? Like, where's the responsibility end for this side of the environment versus that side? All that has to be established. And it can be completely customized. So it takes some time to really plan that out and what that's going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just a couple of plugs here since we are talking about Citrix. I think Mark did a great overview of the pros and cons of each of the different deployment models for infrastructure. One thing I will say is when we talk about Citrix, at least managing it from a workload perspective, there are some pros that help mitigate some of these cons we're looking at right here. So for example, if we look at public cloud and how we pay for what we use. We all know if we've ever tested Azure or AWS, you're trying to mitigate costs by not utilizing resources that you're not leveraging. And if we're talking about from a workload perspective, Citrix does have some built-in features that can help reduce that. It can actually, they have something called auto scale, can power on and off machines based on things like time of day, based on utilization to help mitigate that con of what a public cloud provides. So we can try and help reduce that cost, as well as they have another tool called Workspace Environment Management. You might be using that on-prem today. It's a great acquisition from Citrix from a company called Northscale, which helps really improve the utilization of those workloads. So it helps optimize the CPU, the RAM, the IOPS, which means if we're able to optimize the CPU and RAM, we could potentially host more users onto a single multi-session desktop, which means if we can increase that user density from say 10 users to 12 users, well, now we don't have to power on as many desktops. So we're reducing our costs of our public cloud consumption. And then similarly, if we look at a hybrid cloud model, I think Mark alluded to this earlier, but with the Citrix control plane with the management console, it's one of the few solutions out there that can actually manage workloads across that hybrid model. So on-prem workloads, public cloud workloads, even private cloud workloads can all be managed from a single management console. So there's definitely some takeaways we can talk through about that if anyone would be interested following today's webinar.
Yeah, great points, Ryan. And if anybody has any questions about some of the things that have come up so far, feel free to include those questions in the chat box too, and we'd be happy to address them. So from here, I think some people may have some questions or some thoughts around, well, what if I want to remain on premise? And what do I need to consider if I do want to remain on premise? Well, do know that we can still meet you. You can still can have everything on premise and still move to a Citrix Cloud model. Some of the things that you'll want to consider, I think, Mark, you wanted to kind of touch on a few of these points that they'll need to maintain if they do remain on premise, I believe.
Yeah, so you guys, I mentioned already that you, of course, you'll have to maintain your physical hardware on the cycles, your refresh cycles. But you also have if you own perpetual licenses in Citrix, then you own those, they're yours. And you just pay your maintenance every year. Your maintenance entitles you to be able to call Citrix support with an issue. All right, as long as you're on a supported version of the platform, they will support you. But it also allows you to upgrade to the latest version, the latest supported version, long-term version, whatever it is. And it gives you that entitlement. But of course, if you stay on-prem, not much is going to change, right? You just continue your same maintenance cycles. And yeah, not much is different.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would note too is just do remember last year in October of 2020, Citrix did end of sale their perpetual licensing. So for any customers that are considering adding additional licenses with an on-premise environment, you were grandfathered in the fact that your licenses would remain supported, but additional licenses would need to be purchased under a subscription model. And we can certainly help you with that growth while preparing long-term for these expected changes. But those are certainly some of the things you'd want to consider as you remain on premise. When thinking about transitioning to the Citrix Cloud model, there's a few terms that Citrix itself uses in regarding to the cloud transition. What you're doing here is that you're really just moving your perpetual software into a cloud equivalent service offering so that it can remain evergreen and updated. When you're doing a cloud trade up, you're moving from your current version of software into a higher equivalent cloud equivalent model or service license. And then hybrid rights are going to be included for any customers transitioning off-prem into the cloud, knowing that both of your licensing would be supported under Citrix. Those are some of the common terms that you'll hear Citrix using and us as well as we do transition you into that service model. Some business questions to consider as you are approaching or thinking about moving over into this model. One of the most common questions I hear when talking with customers is, can I phase this approach? Do know that you no longer need a 500 user minimum requirement for hybrid rights, that Citrix has gone away with that rule. And now you can trade up in increments of 25. So phasing your transition approach is much more doable today. You might also consider which workloads are easier for you to move than others. Do know that your VDAs can stay on-prem. You don't have to move your VDAs to a cloud option, but you could consider, does it make sense for me to move some of those VDAs or whatnot? And some great tools at your hands are Citrix has a 30-day Citrix Cloud trial, and Wincourse can also stand up a free proof of concept of what those workloads would look like in a cloud. So those are some great resources and some ways that we could help you start testing or looking at what that transition would look like. And the most common questions, of course, are what are some of the costs associated with moving or transitioning my licensing over? The great news is that Citrix has compelling transition and trade-up discounts and promotions that can really help with making the costs more neutral for you. And then you'll also want to consider how easy it is for you to migrate Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops on-premise to the Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop service. So for some of your existing customers, if you have a catalog of information in Studio, Citrix has now introduced a new tool to make that transition much easier, and that's going to be under Citrix's automated configuration tool, which would mean move that data over seamlessly into Citrix Cloud. These are definitely some of the more common business questions that come across with our customers as they're considering moving to Citrix Cloud, and some of the different ways that we've been able to address their concerns. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on a few helpful resources for you to consider as you're evaluating and making decisions on this transition. Citrix has some great cloud training on their website. So as Citrix customers, you would be able to access what the Citrix Cloud training is, have any IT administrators or system admins also be trained on what this move would mean. Citrix has some great resources on how to simplify your cloud strategy and taming your cloud sprawl. And the last helpful resource that is a great one is a total cost of ownership calculator. This is through Azure, in which you can actually see what moving some of these workloads would look like in Azure.
So we got one question on the board here that I'll just bring up. So what is the break-even time between subscription price and perpetual license cost? David, I don't want to put you on the spot, but perhaps you could take that one.
Yeah, actually, not to just play pinball, but I think Dan Chiari with Citrix deals with these questions on a daily basis. And that's definitely one thing. We'll share these resources as well for the TCO calculator. It's obviously very dependent on your licensing size, what you're looking to move over. So Dan, I don't know if you want to help out with that as well, what you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're spot on. It's going to be a case by case basis, but if we were to have a rough average there, I would say in that 3 to 5 year is where, or rather after that 3 to 5 year point, that's really where you're going to see the break even. And I know just a couple of notes I've been taking here in regards to the end of availability announcement. That won't change anything with renewal. And then I know we mentioned end of availability, or rather end of sale, on some of our perpetual licensing. It's also not going to touch some of our traditional ADC and network licensing just yet, although we are starting to introduce a lot more service-based networking options, which is something I'm sure we'll kind of talk about on a later webinar here. But that's something that will be very compatible with the Citrix Cloud model. As you know, as the team mentioned on the call, I think really kind of putting more of that emphasis on the fact that we can manage workloads from anywhere with that unified control plane. So that's the networking component. We're starting to update services that can be plugged right into that as well. So hopefully that answers a few questions for you guys. But yeah, after that 3 to 5 year mark.
And then
Awesome.
I see a more technical question here. Maybe Mark and I can tag team this one. So what happens to my data that's on premise if we go to the cloud? So I'll start that first. I think it depends on what you're referring to when you say the cloud. If you're referring to transitioning your on-premise Citrix environment over to Citrix Cloud, your data that's on-prem stays the same. So you would just install your pair of cloud connectors on-premise. Those would plug up over to Citrix Cloud, and your workloads would still remain on-premise. So that means your data and all of your applications are also going to remain on-premise. If you're looking to transition to a public cloud provider and move your workloads over there, that's a different story. Your data might need to be migrated over to that cloud provider if you're planning to do a complete shift. I don't know if, Mark, you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's really nothing to lose as far as your data is concerned. If you have stuff on file shares, that's still going to remain wherever that the file share is. You can choose to put that next to where you move your VDAs if you choose to move your workload machines. But all of your site data would be housed in the Citrix Cloud control plane. And that's really more of metadata. It's not really proprietary to the organization. So yeah, you're not going to lose anything as far as moving over to the Citrix Cloud.
But yeah, great question so far. Will you be sharing the helpful resource slide? No, Brittany, if you want to take that one.
Yes, I believe we'll be sending out a follow-up with a recording to this webinar, as well as access to those links in the resource center or resource slide. And that should also be included in some of the follow-up too regarding the gift cards for the Grubhub.
So if you guys have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Dan, Ryan, myself, Brittany, anybody here at Wincourse. We'll be happy to help you guys out any way we can. We thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to